Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Intercooler podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. This is episode 228. Andrew, we're launching a sort of new occasional series, podcast series with this one. We're just going to call it Icons because that does the job. And each time we're going to pick out an iconic car and tell the full story of it.
Yeah, and sometimes it may not even be a car. It might be an engine, but something which has had a profound effect on the way that we view cars, all the things that power them, or whatever. Yeah,
and they don't always need to be very expensive cars.
Nope.
As is the case with this one. We're starting with the Mazda MX-5.
Yes.
And actually, by the time this episode goes out, our review of every single generation of MX-5, the written review and the video will be out on YouTube as well.
Yes.
We had a great day, didn't we? An example of each of the four generations on some great roads in Wales.
Yeah.
And it was so instructive driving one of each back to back on the same roads.
Yeah.
That is how you learn what the key differences are and what also the sort of fundamental similarities are. You can't do it without driving them all on the same day on the same roads.
Or certainly nothing like as well. And wasn't it just so instructive in, I know we say this all the time, but you know, it just reinforces the fact that you don't need to spend, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds. You don't need 700 horsepower. You just need a car that was configured by people who know what they're doing and do it for all the right reasons.
Yeah, you do. We're going to look at the history of the MX-5 and talk about what the four generations are like to drive. I do just want to start, though. I wonder about the MX-5. Does it have a bit of an image problem? Is it considered by some probably red-blooded males to not be a true sports car?
Yeah, I think you get this, don't you, with all cars that are bought by people for reasons other than what they like to drive.
Yeah.
And there's no question at all that many people, probably most people, when they think, oh, I'd like an MX-5, they aren't thinking, oh, yeah, of course, because it's going to have a, you know, twin cam 16 valve engine and it's rear wheel drive, so I'll be able to, you know, skid it about. I don't think that's the thought process at all. I think they just think, I can afford it. It looks great. I'm going to look great in it. It'll be kind of fun, but it'll also work. It'll fit my life. It's not likely to go wrong. I'm not going to have to struggle to get the hood up and down. My other half isn't going to complain because it's too noisy or uncomfortable. And I think those are the sorts of thought process. So those sorts of things, I mean, yeah, it's sort of, you know, unless you're absolutely killing yourself and you're in a Caterham or an aerial atom or whatever, you know, something completely wild and impractical, then somehow that makes it less of a proper driver's car, which is, of course, cobblers. It just makes it a better car because it appeals to a wider range of people. So just because a car might appeal to some person, but not for reasons other than what it's like to drive, doesn't make it bad to drive or in any way less of a car.
No. No, and actually, if you talk to the people at Mazda, they are convinced that with each generation, they're building the purest driver's car that they possibly can for that sort of money.
Yeah.
That's what they set out to do.
Yeah.
And they, you know, there are creature comforts in there. They don't want you to slaughter yourself to own one of these things. You know, they have AC and nav and all the rest of it, and
but that's why they're so clever. I mean, can you remember just putting the roof up and down?
Yeah,
they're so easy to do, even before they got any kind of power assistance. And if you were, as I was, writing about these cars when they were new, and just what a confounded nonsense it was to try and do that sort of process with any other convertible of the era. And it just came along and everything was just easy. And I think that's why they were so clever, because they understood that it wasn't enough for it to be great looking and for it to be good to drive. It had to actually work. It had to fit into people's lives too. And I think that there is an incredible lesson with this car. And I think it's probably why we're doing it, doing this series and starting off with the MX-5, because doesn't it show that if you do something and you focus relentlessly on the product, you create something which endures, not just for its lifetime, but for generation after generation. And doubtless, at some stage in the future, we will be doing one of these on the Porsche 911, because it kind of like night follows day. But it's the same thing. You know, it's what you were saying about, is that they just created the best car they could. and they've been cashing in on that for the last 35 years.
Yeah, 35 years, yeah.
Yeah,
And
half a lifetime.
in that time,
In old money.
1.2 million have been built.
Yeah.
So what is it? I think the point that I make time and again with the MX-5 is that it's barely changed. It's stayed so true to that original formula over the years. It's barely changed. And perhaps to some extent that's true of the 911. I mean, the 911 has swollen in size and power output and grip and technology and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But it's still, relative to other cars in the class, quite compact. It's still rear engine, still 2+2. Still very, very usable. Still
a flat six.
Yeah, the basic principle.
Yeah, still essentially quite a short wheelbase, even though that has grown massively. It's just an evolution on a theme. So the secret would seem to me to get it right
first time. Yeah.
And
then you just build and build.
And throw everything at it. Throw every resource, every brain you have into creating something that is as clearly conceived and fluently executed as you possibly can, because if you can do that, then, as I said, you will be reaping the rewards of that for decades.
So how little has the MX-5 changed over the 4 generations? Well, the current one, the ND, is wider than the original, but it's actually shorter, which is incredible. If you don't get the RF one with the folding hard top, you just get a normal.
And I wouldn't
one.
Get an RF.
Really? See, I think I might because I like the look. But if you get a normal one, it's less than 1,100 kilograms. So it's still very, very light. I mean,
incredibly light.
Much heavier than the original. I think they're 900 or something. But that is a very, very simple car compared to the current one.
Yeah.
So for it to have only put on couple hundred kilos or whatever, probably less than a couple hundred kilos over 35 years.
It will be less than a couple hundred kilos over 35 years.
Must be 150 or something.
Yeah.
So that's remarkable. But then you look at the technical specification. Twin cam engine up front, 4-cylinder, naturally aspirated.
Yeah.
Manual gearbox, rear drive.
Yeah.
2 seats, convertible roof. So in terms of all the stuff that you can read on a spec sheet, it's barely changed.
Yeah.
The size has barely changed. The weight has only crept up over time.
Yeah.
The core philosophy behind the car is the same. But then you drive them, and they've become faster and grippier over time.
Yeah.
But the basic sort of dynamic fingerprint is just the same.
They feel the same.
They really do.
You know what? You could drive them blind. If you drove a Mark 1...
Yeah.
And then they put you in another car with a blindfold on, and it happened to be a Mark 4, you'd know where it came from.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And it's all about, they're quite supple. They've got very, very sharp, quite quick steering. They roll markedly in corners. And that's actually really nice because it means you use the weight transfer to sort of manipulate the grip.
Yeah.
And it just puts you front and center of the driving experience. And that's the whole point about them. You're right in the heart of the driving experience.
And also on that, what I love about those cars, which is what makes them so different to, frankly, all hot hatchbacks, is you really sit in them.
Yeah.
You drop down into the car, sort of wraps itself around. You don't feel perched on top of it. You know that you are in a car that was only ever conceived to be a 2-seater sports car from its very design. And, the way the transmission tunnel rises up, and you are snug and you are deeply cocooned within it. And that all by itself provides a completely different driving atmosphere and environment to, any other kind of car.
It is amazing. They're so much fun. They're such fun. And there are people out there who are sort of snooty about the MX-5 because it's not very powerful, because it has, to some extent, been co-opted by a group of people who are not interested in the stuff that we are.
Yeah.
But they are drivers' cars. And honestly, if you haven't had a proper go in one and you sort of take a dim view of them, you've just got to go and drive one on a great road and you'll have a blast.
Yeah.
You will. If you enjoy driving, you will enjoy it.
So we're not talking, Caterham / Lotus Elise levels.
It's not quite that.
It's not quite that, but then at the same time, it doesn't impose the limitations that those sort of cars do.
That's right.
So there is a trade-off. But I'll tell you what, it's closer than you'd think, given how incredibly easy to live with they are.
Yeah, it is closer than you think.
Yeah.
And you also don't need to spend a lot of money, depending on which generation you want. I mean, you can find them in the hundreds. I'm not sure that's a good idea.
I wouldn't recommend that.
So probably a couple of grand, $3,000, you could find a really serviceable car.
And that would actually be an NB, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and the NC, the third generation, is getting down to that sort of number as well.
So the original, the NA, the one with the pop-up headlights, they're actually nice ones of those they're getting quite pricey now.
Because it's hard to find an unmolested one.
Yeah.
That hasn't rusted away, frankly, because that is a problem with those cars.
Yeah.
So if you can find a really lovely one, you might be looking at $10,000.
Oh, of an NA. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, you could do.
But even so, if you've got several £1,000s to spend, you'll get a cracking car. And if you really enjoy, honestly, you'll have a great time in it. So let's trot through the history a little bit.
Yes.
Now, Peter Robinson wrote a 2-part story about the gestation of the MX-5, Birth of an Icon, it's called. He wrote that for the Intercooler. And actually on that topic, if you listen to this podcast and you enjoy it and you appreciate what we do, subscribing to the Intercooler is the best way to support it. It's an online ad-free car magazine with a fantastic roster of writers.
The best.
We think it's very good. People seem to like it.
Yeah.
If you want to support the show, just go and subscribe. You can do that from $5.99 a month.
Yeah.
A bit less if you pay annually. So do consider doing that, please.
Yeah, it's the-intercooler.com.
That's right. Yeah. And so this story by Robbo, he deep dives how the car came about. And it is an amazing tale, actually, because it's one of us who made it happen.
Yeah.
It was a car journalist who had the idea, who convinced Mazda to,
because there were lots of other competing ideas for it. One was it was going to be a front engine, front drive car.
Right.
There was a mid-engine concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
A chap called Bob Hall.
Yeah.
He worked for Motor Trend and Auto Week in the US. And he met Mazda chief engineer Kenichi Yamamoto in 1976. They became friends. And here's an extract from Robbo's story, which is up on the Intercooler app and website for you to read now if you want to. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Shortly after the launch of the original RX-7, while on a press trip to Hiroshima in 1978, Hall enjoyed a few minutes in open discussion with Yamamoto, by then head of Mazda R&D. Yamamoto asked Hall what cars Mazda should build in future. This was precisely the opening the animated enthusiast needed. I shifted into overdrive, Hall recalled years later. The bugs in teeth, wind in hair, classically British sportsters were expiring. My idea was to revive the category by recasting Mazda's 323 rear-drive O'Connor box as a two-seat roadster. I did this horrible chalkboard scribble suggesting Mazda should build an affordable, open rear-drive sports car. Yamamoto asked why. I replied because there aren't any left. He seemed to understand, but I didn't think anything would come of it. Yamamoto put on his poker face, so I had no idea what he thought of my idea. Back in the US, Bob wrote a column in Auto Week promoting the rebirth of the open sports car and cajoled other journalists to do the same. 2 years later, Bob got a call from Mazda's chief PR man in North America asking him to a meeting, which turned into a job offer. In October 1981, Hall moved into product planning with Mazda Design in California. One day, while working on the B2000 pickup, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Yamamoto. Bob was told, "You should be working on your two-seat lightweight sports car." That was all Hall needed, though his American boss said he could only work on the project before 8:30 a.m. at lunchtime and after 5:30 p.m. So Bob started at 6 a.m., had lunch at his desk, and after 5:30 p.m. worked on the sports car before going home. I learned this was how Yamamoto tested people, Bob told me, to see how much they really believed in their ideas. If they would work on them in their own time, I guess I passed the test. So it did really come down to one man who basically did what we do right about cars. And it was his idea, his enthusiasm for this idea that brought the MX-5 into being.
And the timing is so interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look at it, that first generation car looks so like a 1960s Lotus Elan. And there's no question at all that the Elan inspired it. But if you think of all those other, great British sports cars, Triumphs and MGs and Lotuses and everything, they'd all gone. There wasn't anything around. And I'm not sure why that is. They got old, weren't replaced, and then suddenly, I guess there was just the space for something which did something which no other car could do. Even so, it must have been quite a brave decision, because there must have been a thought process. Well, nobody else is making one of these. Why not?
Yeah.
But just to go and say, well, we're going to do it anyway. It's great.
So they did buy. It really was. People often say that the MX-5 is the spiritual successor to the Elan, the true spiritual successor to that original Elan. And you often wonder how much truth there is in that, because it's just a romantic story that someone made up one day. But actually, according to Robbo, Mazda did buy second-hand Lotus Elans and Triumph Spitfires and insisted that its people drove them, studied them, understood them, and then stripped them down to get a proper understanding of their simplicity, what made them work. So that's not just a cute tale. It's absolutely true. They really were inspired by
absolutely.
But why would they choose the Elan specifically?
Because I think it embodied everything they wanted their new car to be. Because it was pretty, it was light, it was innovative, it was absolutely first, second, and third a driver's car. And it was in itself, and I'm sure marketing terms this was crucial. It was, for want of a better word, iconic. It was a legend, and I think if you're going to cling on to anyone's shirt tails, then that's the way to do it, isn't it? It kind of gave as long as it was a risk, because I guess if the car had been poor, it merely looked the part, but it had been a bit rubbish to drive and had been heavy and had just been a sort of mishmash, then Mazda would have been kicked from pillar to post, and rightly so. But I think because they were so purely motivated, and because what they were trying to do was a genuine homage, a tribute to this iconic 60s British sports car, I can remember at the time a few people were sort of sniffy about it and saying, well, and this is back in the day where it was very, very common to hear people just knocking all kinds of Japanese product because they were identified for being sort of cheap and poorly built, and just going, oh well, it's just a sort of cheap Japanese rip-off. But I don't think anybody said that after they'd driven it.
So it was in 1985 that Yamamoto became Mazda president. So he's rising up the ranks, and one of his first acts was to recommend production of the MX-5. 4 years later, there it was at the Chicago Auto Show, 1989. The Mazda MX-5 exists. Now, you wrote, I believe this is right, the original road test for Autocar.
I did.
On the first generation MX-5.
I did.
Blimey, 1990?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Well, I mean,
did it seem like a true sports car to you, from afar?
Absolutely. From afar, yeah, you'd approach it thinking, you'd approach it thinking, God, I hope this is as good as it looks. The car had been driven in the US, and there were some quite warm noises coming out of that, but we didn't really know what we'd be. I think we probably knew it would be pretty good. I don't think any of us knew how good it would be. I can remember being completely blown away by it, because it cost. I can't remember what it cost, but it wasn't an expensive car at all. And it was just so. It was such an engaging, natural, well-balanced, well thought out. There wasn't a thing wrong with it. It was so incredibly complete, and you thought to yourself, only people who really, really got it could possibly have come up with a car like this, because it wasn't just that it had, a nice little twin cam engine with rear wheel drive, double wishbone suspension at every corner.
Yeah.
The gearbox, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It was I mean, it was perfect. You couldn't improve upon it. It felt exactly as you would want a gearbox for that kind of car to feel. It was short and it had a very mechanical feel. It was incredibly precise. It was quick. The car had, very appropriately low gear ratio, so you were able to wring the absolute most out of every gear. And the balance of the thing was just amazing. You could just balance this thing. I mean, it wasn't a car that would do anything to extremes. It wasn't a big understeer or a big oversteer. It was what cars like that should be. It was just basically
balanced.
neutral.
Yeah.
And then you could steer it on the throttle, and you could do all these and you're sitting yourself thinking, well, hang on a second, and you have to remember that this was. Mazda wasn't regarded then in the way that it's regarded now.
Oh, so it must have almost felt like it. So they'd done some RX-7s and
exactly. But
a couple of bits and pieces.
But mainly you thought of them as making sort of cheap Japanese tin boxes.
Yeah.
And they come along, and you also have to remember the other context, which was the great Japanese. I was about to say invasion. I don't mean that, but the great product offensive. Of that period, when they produced, Nissan had produced the 300SX and Lexus had done the LS400 and Honda were doing the NSX, and we were all thinking, blimey, these guys are just, knocking it out of the park. And the MX-5 was probably the ultimate exponent of that. And you just thought, well, how could you possibly compete with that? It was genuinely a landmark. When that car first turned up in 1990, I can remember just the steering, the feel of the steering, and the instruments and the driving position, and it just felt absolutely right from the outset. Incredible.
And did it win whatever the handling test was called that year?
It did.
Can you remember what was in that?
Oh.
That's a big ask.
It would have been things like 944s, and I can't remember. But this little Japanese sports car, which would almost certainly have been the cheapest car there when I won it.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
So I haven't spent a lot of time in NA MX-5s, but driving that one the other day was just fantastic because the one that we had was a 1990 car, so a very early UK car.
Yeah.
1.6.
Yeah.
5-speed box.
Yeah.
I think I was expecting
no Mazda logo on the nose, which you can tell it's a very early one. That's how you tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was expecting it to feel like a classic car.
Yeah.
Quite rickety, very wobbly.
Yeah.
Slow, imprecise steering. I was expecting all that stuff.
Yeah.
There's a bit of shake to it, as you'd expect, but honestly, it felt stiffer than I was imagining. The body shell, I mean. The steering was pin sharp.
Yeah.
Gearbox, brilliant. Properly lively engine. It's 1.6 still then. Not much power, but quick enough. I was astonished by it. Loved it. It felt really modern. And I suppose when a car is just right and simple, those things are enduring, aren't they? And that's why it doesn't feel ancient.
Yeah. And and properly configured. I mean, I mentioned it before, but that double wishbone suspension is it would have been so easy to have put a strut at the front and a B-Max or whatever, and just done it cheaply. And they could, because it would have still been light, they could have probably still got it to handle okay, but they didn't do that. They went down the same route that that Ferrari was going down, and they got the best located suspension system that they could, because it mattered to them that they got it right.
Which plays into this point I made earlier. They are convinced then and now that they're building a driver's car, a true driver's car. That's how they set about doing it, and that they are doing that. That is what they're doing. So the second generation, the NB, was really a sort of heavily updated first generation, wasn't it? Same basic car underneath, really. And I mean, still fun to drive, much the same kind of driving experience.
Not as highly regarded.
No, it's not. And the one that we had was a 10th anniversary, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Actually, I thought it felt like an MX-5 trying to be something an MX-5 shouldn't be. I thought it was trying to be a bit more of a focused performance car rather than just a lovely, balanced, beautiful thing. And so it had a stiffer ride, a bit busier, which seemed to make the structure feel a bit more compromised. So for me, just not as fun as the previous car, but it's all relative. It's still a vibrant, lively little thing.
So I think those cars have had a bit of a bad rap. They don't look as nice.
They don't.
They certainly don't look as nice on the interior.
I think that's a big part of the MX-5's issue, was the look of the NB.
Yeah.
Because it looks too cute.
Yeah.
It looks like it's trying to be, a kid's toy thing. And I think that's why a lot of people look at the MX-5 and think it's not a serious sports car, because that one looks too sweet.
Yeah, it does. But actually, I really enjoyed driving it. I did. It was, it showed that the car could cope with a little extra power. I think it felt a little bit stiffer. I didn't think that it lost a great deal to the first one. And today, when you look at the price disparities between them, I think there's a very strong argument. If you just want to get the most affordable car, real driver's car, and you're not that worried about the looks and you don't mind the sort of slightly messy interior, I think that's still a strong argument for it.
Yeah, I'd always want an NA, an original one, a first generation one.
Yeah.
But you're right, if the budget won't stretch, the MB's a pretty good substitute, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's with the NC, the third generation one, that was probably the biggest step change for the MX-5. And when you step from the B to the C, it feels a world apart. Certainly the interior.
Yeah.
The interior does feel, like the interior of a modern car.
Yeah. I think structurally as well, there was a big step then.
Big step.
Yeah.
I think they were up to a 2-litre engine then as well, from 1.8.
Yeah.
So more power.
Yeah.
It is a bigger car.
Yeah.
It's the biggest one, actually, of the lot, the third generation, the NC. Heaviest as well.
Yeah.
And so I think we were probably both expecting that to be the weak link, the whipping boy. In some regards, maybe it is, but I was surprised by how much fun I had in that.
I really enjoyed it.
There was a 25th anniversary one, wasn't it? So the facelifted NC. So it looks a bit better.
With
some big upgrades.
With the metal roof as well.
Oh, yes, it did have the hard top roof.
Yeah.
And I remember chasing you. I can't remember what you were in. Maybe one of the earlier ones. I don't know. I was in the NC. It was wet.
Yeah.
And I was pedaling quite hard to keep up. And this is the lovely thing about an MX-5. They're on skinny tyres, very moderate tyres. They're not stupidly grippy, aggressive things.
Yeah.
They're very, very light cars. And so when the rain comes down, nothing changes for you.
You really don't slow down very much, do you?
You keep going,
No.
and you just find that the thing's sliding about a bit more, which makes it really, really fun.
And when they start sliding about, you don't suddenly go into crisis management and think, oh, God, I've got to say that. You just go along with it. It just becomes part of the way you drive the car.
Yeah, it's so progressive, so predictable. It's great.
Can I tell the story of the launch of that car?
Go on then. Oh, yes. I've heard this one. Yeah, go on. It bears repeating.
So, my understanding, the way that it was told to me, when they thought to themselves, where are we going to launch this car? They thought, well, the two biggest markets for this car are Japan and America. What's between Japan and America? And they looked at their Times Atlas of the world, and they found this island called Hawaii, this island group. So they thought, well, we'll do it there. I don't think they thought very much harder about it. And doesn't it sound wonderful going to Hawaii to drive a car?
I'd love to.
Oh, wow. So we flew to LA, and then we waited there for a bit, and then we flew to Honolulu, and waited there for a bit, and then we flew to whatever island they were launching the car from. So that was quite tiring. Then we discovered that we were going to be allowed an entire hour and a half in the car, but you had to share it with someone.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got to drive this car for 45 minutes. We then discovered that this island was basically a police state with more traffic than I think I've ever seen anywhere else. And we found one road, which I think must have gone over the middle of the island. And basically, there were 40 MX-5s just going up and down this road because it was the only way you could put your foot down to any extent at all. And then we did that, and we gave the cars back, and then we repeated the journey to go home. And I calculated later that for 45 minutes of driving the car, I had travelled for 44 hours there and back. So basically, it was an hour of travel for every minute at the wheel.
It's just hopeless, isn't it?
I mean, yes, it was utterly... It was one of the most bizarre car launches I've been on, possibly the worst car launch I've ever been on, but I've been dining out on the story ever since, so I'm now quite glad that I went.
Well, the hilarious thing is they flew you via California. I mean, how many spots in California would have been fantastic for us?
Yes, we could have just stopped there and just, yeah, absolutely. No, well.
That's hilarious.
Never mind.
So actually, yeah, the NC, people often get quite sniffy about the NC in particular, but it was fun. On those roads in the wet, it was brilliant.
I also did with Jethro Bovingdon and Matt Pryor. I did a 24-hour race in one of those, and I can remember thinking 24 hours in an MX-5, that's going to be hard work. It was one of these ones at Silverstone, and we were pretty much the slowest car on the grid, but we did amazingly well because it just kept going. 24 hours. I think I think someone might have gone over a curb and damaged a wheel bearing, but that was like a sort of 5-minute change. Other than that, and I can remember you could basically hang on to anything through the corners. And you get these massive 911s with all these huge amounts of air, and you can just sit on them going through corners, and then they go flying away at this straight. But that was really, really good fun. And it just showed just how versatile those cars are. I mean, on one hand, people use them as sort of, look at me cars for, posing around. On the other hand, you can go and, race them for 24 hours and have a really good time doing it.
Yeah, my first ever race was in an MX-5.
There you go.
It was the 2014, 10 years ago, Race of Remembrance at Anglesey.
Yeah.
My first ever race.
Wow.
And you know what your first one is like. You're absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
For days and days.
Good car to do your first race in.
But that's it. It was absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
And qualifying in November at Anglesey is chucking it down. But it was so...
Did you fall off?
No, it was absolutely fantastic. I remember because once the visor's down and you're in qualifying mode, something changes, something switches in your mind.
It stops being frightening.
And the spray coming up from the cars in front almost blinds you. You can only see the headlights. But you don't back off. Sorry, the tail lights. You don't back off. You just follow them.
Yeah.
You just follow them through, and pick the cars off one by one. And I absolutely loved it. And I was third fastest in my first ever qualifying session. And most of the cars there were Mazdas MX-5s.
Yeah.
And I was the quickest one by a second.
Wow.
I was pleased with that.
I bet you were.
Yeah, that was a great memory actually. Qualifying and racing that car at Anglesey. But you're right, it's absolutely the ideal kind of machine for your first race because it's not going to snap your head off.
No.
They just don't do that. So the current car is the fourth generation, the ND.
Yeah.
I think it was new in 2015. So it was either in 15 or 16 that I did the media launch, the press launch of that car. On the, what's the road near Nice?
Col d'Avance.
Col d'Avance.
Yeah.
Fantastic roads around there.
Yeah, bit better than Hawaii.
Yes, much better. And yeah, I remember driving that early ND and finding the body roll just too contrived. I think they've wound it back a little bit now. I think it's just a bit more contained and a bit more natural. But the engine was slightly disappointing in that car. It was
which engine was it?
It was the 2 litre.
Yeah,
it was the bigger one. It was done at 6,500 RPM. And I just thought, it doesn't feel to me like a sports car engine. It feels like a saloon car engine.
They did a 1.5 as well, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
Which I quite liked.
See, I don't think I ever drove that one.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a nicely balanced, really fun, back to basics little sports car. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't tried it. And so it was in 2018, I believe, that Mazda updated the ND MX-5. And the big news was the engine suddenly found another 1,000 RPM at the top end.
Yeah.
It went to 7.5. A chunk more power as well.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it felt like a proper sports car engine.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe that overnight like that it had gone from a slightly underwhelming engine to the perfect kind of motor for that car. I just thought that was fantastic, and I loved it. I've loved that MX-5 ever since.
I think it looks really cool.
Yeah.
Really, really purposeful. And yeah, we were skidding about in that one, which we borrowed for this test. I mean, an amazingly credible car for what it is. I mean, and you know, and it's actually quite an old car now. People keep on talking about, what's the NE going to be? And maybe we'll have a quick chat about that in a minute. But actually, getting it and drive it, and I guess it's when you have a car of enduring qualities, you know. Good handling is good handling, however old the car is. A nice noise is a nice noise. Clear, fluent steering is, and these are ageless, timeless qualities.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really matter you get in the car and it's a few years old, because that's not how it feels. Because it's just what you feel more is just how much fun you're having.
Do you fit?
Yeah. No, actually, no. The ND I didn't, did I? No, because it's got a lot smaller, hasn't it?
Yeah, it is a lot smaller.
I mean, yes, I did fit it, but I think I had to drive it in my socks, or I chose to, because it is, yeah, but I'm 6'3" and a bit. And yeah, I mean, it would probably stop me having one.
Yeah, I remember when I first drove one in 2016 or 15 and then 18, I really enjoyed them, but I just didn't feel like I quite fit in them properly.
Yeah.
I would have the seat all the way back and it wasn't quite far enough, so I'd have to angle the back of the seat more upright so I could go back another notch just to give myself a bit of space.
Yeah.
And that was always frustrating. In this, because they have just updated it again for 2024, and that's what we had. I think I fit a bit better now.
You think they just changed the seat or something?
I think they've done something. It's that or I've lost an inch over the last few years. But I felt more comfortable in it. I could still do with a little bit more space. They've perhaps been a little bit greedy with the shrink on that car. But I'm now comfortable enough that I could have one.
And how much more preferable is it that they've gone that way than the other way?
Yeah, I mean, massively so.
You know, bigger, fatter, heavier, whatever.
Massively so. That's what I really admire about the MX-5, though. Yeah. They haven't allowed it to bloat and swell and get heavy, significantly heavier.
And that's the thing. Yeah. That is the thing. You know, we so often complain that cars have grown in size and grown in weight and, are that much harder to enjoy as a result. And the MX-5 is kind of like the antidote to that, because it has stayed so true to its original values. It is, despite all the legislation that it has to pass, and this is a globally homologated car, it does kind of give the lie to this suggestion that, cars can't be light anymore because they have to be able to, have this level of feature content and that level of, crash safety. Well, no, because there's a car out there which weighs 1,100 kilos. And
it's got it all.
A ton less than a C63 estate.
Indeed.
And it's actually probably more fun to drive.
So Mazda won't say anything at the moment about what the NE MX-5 might be like.
No. There was a concept, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. I mean, they didn't suggest that was what the new MX-5 might be like, but no. I mean, it's a little compact Mazda sports car, so I think we can assume that it will be inspired by that at least. And it did look fantastic, that thing.
Yeah, but it was an EV, wasn't it? With a range extender rotary engine attached to it, with like 370 horsepower. Okay. Do you think an EV MX-5 is a contradiction in terms?
Oh, I mean, that fizzy engine and manual shift is such a key part of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, particularly with the technology as it is right now, because it's not going to be 1,100 kilograms.
No. I mean, I'm sure it would be light. And, as we saw with the Hyundai i5N, there are all sorts of things that you can do to simulate what it's like to have a, if not a gear shift, then certainly paddles and engine noise and that sort of thing. But I don't think it works in an MX-5, because an MX-5 has, through all its life, it has, its core attribute has been its authenticity. So if you start making it fake, synthesized, I don't know.
Yeah. Go and do an EX5. That's fine. It can be 1,300 kilograms. It can be a bit bigger. It can be electric. That could be really good fun. But an MX-5, I think it does need that fizzy 2-litre 4-cylinder engine. We don't know when it's going to come, the NE, but on past form, so it's probably due next year or something.
Yeah,
or the year after.
I think legislation. I think is there not some legislation which means they can't sell the current car past 25 or 26?
Yeah, okay. So I mean, it's not far off.
And they're not going to abandon the territory, are they? They're not going to just say we're not going to do that anymore.
No, not at all. No, they can't. I think they have said that it will be electrified, but that might mean hybrid. It might even just mean mild hybrid.
It's meaningless, isn't it?
Yeah, that is.
Just put a 48-volt system on it. You can say it's electrified.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll wait and see. But finally, then, to wrap up this Icons episode on the MX-5, I think we should just discuss the rivals, the few that have come along.
Very few.
To have a pop at the MX-5 and walked away with a bloodied nose. So what's sort of most credible?
Most credible? Well, I guess the original MR2 was around before the MX-5. It predates it. That was a very credible car. That beautiful twin cam 16-valve engine, revving to 7,800, mid-engine, incredible balance. That was, and that, as I say, that predates, considerably predates the MX-5. Other than that, I guess the second generation MR2 not so much, because it was a bigger car and it was a bit unwieldy and they had some handling issues with it. The third generation MR2 is probably the one which has come closest to it. But to me, never quite captured the same magic as the MX-5. There was the Fiat Barchetta, which was never sold in the UK, left-hand drive only, which was quite pretty, but it was let down by its underpinnings. It was essentially just a sort of hatchback powertrain.
Yeah, so they went down the opposite route to Mercedes, to Mazda, excuse me, and just built using what they already had and built a cheaper, easier car. Yeah, they didn't do the hard yards like Mazda did.
No. There was the Alpha Spider, but that was a bigger, more expensive car. And again, front engine, front wheel drive. You're never going to get that kind of balance, that kind of driving involvement. If you're powering the front end, the wrong end of the car. Yeah.
MG?
Yeah. I mean, it was a good effort. The
F and the TF.
The F and the TF. TF much more so than the F. Weird driving position in those cars. I think probably still quite underrated. TF certainly. But still too little too late. I mean, the fact it was mid-engine was a very definite feather in its cap, but it was never going to be built in anything like sufficient volumes to pose a material threat to the MX-5, and it just wasn't as complete as the MX-5. It didn't give people enough of a reason to not buy an MX-5.
And none of them have stuck around. No, that's the key thing the MX-5 has.
Yeah.
35 years, 4 generations.
Yeah.
And this is the key thing about that car. It has stayed so true to that original vision.
And that's what I hope more than anything else for the next one. I just hope that it is still an MX-5.
Yeah. It is amazing, isn't it, that idea Bob Hall had probably the best part of 50 years ago, 40-something years ago. You can still buy something that is true to that original vision.
Yeah.
All these years later. It just shows. But the thing is that it's a simple vision, though, isn't it? It's just inherently right. There's no real genius.
Even in the 1970s, the idea was ages old. You look at, MGs of the 1930s. They're exactly that. They're front engine, rear drive, manual, nicely balanced, fun little things. The formula doesn't change.
There is so much complication in modern cars.
Yeah.
And actually, they just need to be inherently right.
Yeah.
Simplicity. A clear purpose.
Yeah. A vision.
Yeah. It's just
a clear vision, fluently executed.
So few cars seem to understand that and get that right. But when they do, you get an icon like the Mazda MX-5.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, let us know which icon we should pick next. I mean, some of them are sort of more obvious than others, but it'd be nice to do some less obvious ones, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
With perhaps a more interesting backstory.
Please don't all say Porsche 911.
I mean, that's a banker anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
As if we don't rattle on enough about it.
We are going to do it.
Yes. Okay, fine. Okay, well, let us know which cars or engines or whatever else you'd like us to
series
have a look
of cars
at.
Or, Could we do, I don't know, racetracks?
Maybe.
Yeah.
What else might there be?
We deliberately called it icons so that basically we could just make it up and go along and do whatever we wanted.
Yeah, there's
a
lot of meat on this bone.
Yeah,
people. Yeah. Okay. Well, we do need to wrap this one up. So thank you ever so much for listening or for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, and if you are, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. If you're just listening through a podcast app, follow the show or subscribe to the show, whatever it's called on the app that you're using. It might just be a plus symbol. Press it. It really helps us. And in return, we'll keep doing this podcast every week.